Hello and welcome to this special edition of Mr. Das P1's Airgun Corner, where today we'll be looking at the BSA Scorpion MK. And in this video we'll be looking at how to strip this classic air pistol right down to nearly every component, where we'll take a look at the trigger assembly with some close-up shots of the trigger safety mechanism. And we'll also be looking at how to put a new breech seal in, including how to make some homemade tools to strip the gun down, and ways of bringing new life into the plastic pistol grip. So let's start with the strip down. So before removing the mainspring and the piston assembly, I had to make some tools. So I made two options. The first one, as you can see here, is made out of an old camping frame tent pole. And by using a hacksaw and filing a slot out, I was able to make quite a nice handy tool. And as a second option, I made a totally different tool with some aluminium plate where I drilled two holes into it and then fixed in some 4mm threaded rod. And as you can see there, this was also a very effective idea because I could use the vise to clamp it into. Now once you start to compress the mainspring inside, the retaining pin just pulls out. You don't have to hit it with a punch. The mainspring and the spring guide will now come out quite easily. And in this case the spring was pretty straight, so I decided to keep that one for this project. So next we have to get the piston out of the cylinder, and as you can see there, it was seized in. A common fault with these pistols will be where the buffer washer behind the piston seal, and it basically seizes up inside the cylinder. So a few gentle taps with a parallel punch or even a wooden drift will help to get the piston out. And as you can see here, we've got a perish buffer washer. And the next job, we've got to remove this retaining clip, which can be quite a tricky job. And here I'm using a pick and a fine screwdriver. And once you've got it out, you can reuse it, but you've got to be careful in how you compress it back into shape. So here we are now, just removing the piston O-ring with another pick. And I took a measurement of this and it came in at around 27.8mm. And as with all restorations, I give things a nice gentle clean up with whatever tools I've got available. So the piston seal was replaced. I also made a buffer washer from a plumbing fitting. And in this case, if you notice there, I used a copper washer instead of the standard steel washer to go inside the piston body. And then I refitted the circlip again, which can be quite a tricky affair. Now prior to this, I gave the piston itself a nice little bit of attention by cleaning it, filing some rough edges down, and giving it a nice light emery clothing and wet and dry, also cleaning inside where the spring will go. So the next few jobs now are basically just cleaning things up, and here we are just giving the inside of the cylinder a nice clean out. And looking at the spring here, it's always recommended that you get the end of the spring finely ground, almost to a mirror finish, which is getting into the realms of tuning up a spring airgun for a smoother action and better performance. So it's now time to start to put things back together, and there is a picture of the sub-assembly having cleaned everything up. Now here I'm using some Teflon based grease for the piston, and ideally you need gun grease for this job, which contains molybdenum disulfide. And as you can see, everything here gets a nice light coating of grease. And here I'm using a bore scraper to create a leading edge for the piston to go into. Then I've used some fine wet and dry just to clean the ends off. Use the magnet just to check for any burrs, and then give it another light greasing. And as you can see there, the piston has a nice leading edge now to go into the cylinder, and I use a rubber mallet just to help offer it down inside. And to tap the piston all the way down inside the cylinder, I'm using a long plastic rod. And then we have the final assembly of the spring. And again, using the special tools that you need to make for this project, you can see there that I've used the vise to push against, and you can see there where I'm using the vise like a jack to compress the spring. And finally, the pin should locate by hand quite easily. And so with any kind of service like this, the barrel latch just needs a nice little clean before we do anything, and then it's a case of tapping it out with a small parallel punch, removing the parts. You've got a spring and the latch itself, and again give them a little clean down, and then re-lubricating and refitting. If the pistol's stripped down to this level, we might as well give this latch assembly some attention. And there we are, just checking that everything's working okay. It's got a nice feel, a nice action. And then any contact plates and surfaces, we give them a light rubbing down with grease, ready for the final assembly again. And when we're finally tapping this pin through, we've got to get it in the right position so there's enough of a recess for the cap pin to go inside. And you can see there, that's the cap that goes inside the pin. And looking at the breech seal here, the original one had totally perished, and I needed 2 picks to get it out. This one is quite a strong, robust pick, and then I got a finer one to get deeper inside that recess. It's quite a straightforward process to remove the seal. And again, with a gentle wire brush, give things a clean up. And that is the replacement seal, which seems to just fit in quite nicely as a push fit. Now if you do want to have a go at taking all of this trigger assembly apart, I would only do this if it is absolutely necessary because of a failed or worn part. So let's get ourselves familiar with the parts and where they go, starting with the safety shaft, then the intermediate sear, the hammer, and then the spacer. And finally we have the hammer spring just here. And it's always good when you're actually at the workbench to have a look how things go before you put them in situ. And here I'm just looking at the intermediate sear and the hammer as to how the action actually works. And once you understand how things go together outside of the housing, you can then put them together in order. Now refitting all these parts is a very fiddly affair and you need to be patient. Here I'm using a parallel punch as a guide for the spacer washer. And then we have the hammer. The parallel punch here comes in handy as a slave pin. And the next part to put in is the intermediate sear. And just repeat the same process, taking your time. And I use some sticky tape here on the back of the main pin for the assembly just to help push the pin back without everything all falling out. And this gave some clearance for the hammer spring then to be located. And then it's just a case of guiding everything back into position and then referring back to when you had things on the workbench out of the assembly and to latch the spring around the hammer and the intermediate sear. Again, this can be quite a tricky affair and you may have to play about with the pins to give yourself some room. And if we refer back to the photographs previously, here's how we fitted the additional spacer washer. We push the pin back slightly, we gain enough clearance to just slide it between the plate and where the pin is. Then we push the pin back through, and this aligns the spring up much better on the pin than the original factory installation. And if we just pay some attention here to the hammer, if you look on the right hand side of this photograph, I actually ground down the side by a few thou just to give it a little bit more clearance on that side wall of the inner plate. Now on my first attempt of assembling the main sear, the trigger mechanism was releasing but the sear was not dropping in. So it was just a case of redressing the sear on the grindstone and just carefully making the edge good again. So having got the main sear in position, I gave the top of the cylinder a good greasing, which is where the two contact points are when the housing is fitted. And then it's just a case of refitting the 4 button head screws to the housing and the cylinder. And just a word of caution here with this spring, it is prone to flying off and pinging out and they travel far. So when you are working on the assembly, I would always use some sticky tape to keep it in position or have a magnet close by. And as with any restoration, it's always important to give things that little bit of TLC, so I decided to look at the plastic handle grip and give that a good cleaning up, and also looked at touching up the bluing on the metal surfaces. And then the thumb piece arrived in the post, and it was time to fit this as the final part of this restoration project.